Comics. Comics.
Welcome to ORP, otherwise known as Omen Revelations Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Nunley.
And I'm your co-host, Steve Sellers. On ORP, we like to talk about geek stuff, pop culture, including movies and TV series, as well as comic books and comic characters. But that's not all, is it, Mike?
No, it's not, Steve. We're also writers for Omen Comics and Revelation Comics. So we like to talk about both writing and our comics. So podcast and chill with us.
For today's episode, we want to talk about reinventing characters. What makes a good reinvention? When does a character need a drastic makeover? And what is the right or wrong way to reinvent a character? These are the questions we'll be asking today, but it's not as simple a question as it sounds, is it, Mike?
No, it's not. One of the things that makes it so difficult is that whether or not a reinvention is done well depends more on how it's received rather than how it was intended. I think a perfect example of this is when Denny O'Neil and Mike Sekowsky took over Wonder Woman in 1968 and renamed the title Diana Prince as the new Wonder Woman. They had her give up her powers and stay in man's world to help Steve Trevor, who was facing criminal charges. She became a mod fashion designer and a boutique owner and spent a majority of her time worried about her relationship with Steve. O'Neil and Sekowsky's intentions were to modernize the character and in their eyes make her more in line with feminist ideals, but boy did they get it wrong. Feminists hated what they did when they depowered their hero. She was once powerful enough to go toe-to-toe with Superman, and taking that away ruined what they loved about their powerful feminine superhero. And after a hurricane of letters and protests, Wonder Woman's powers and outfit were restored to her. In other words, everybody has their own personal take on reinventions, and for that reason it's hard to nail down exactly what is the right way to do it. But I think we'll definitely cover some of the changes that have gone well and some that haven't, and hopefully as a listener you'll be able to make your own decision.
Oh, yeah, that was a classic example of getting it wrong, like we talked about in our Wonder Woman episode. Fortunately, she went back to her roots later, and then George Perez came in and brought her back to her proper glory. That's the kind of situation that comes up every so often in comics, and sometimes it's part of the writer's job to address those problems. So let's talk about how characters are reinvented in comics. Usually a character will either not work from the outset, for whatever reason, or people lose interest in a character that had previously worked before. Sometimes it's a question of gradually refining a character until it works. For example, like we talked with Daredevil. At other times, creators will introduce drastic changes in the hopes of making the character more interesting. This usually happens in comics with varying results. One way a character can be reinvented is by introducing some kind of drastic character change. Sometimes this can happen because of some new story or character element that's introduced, or some new way of interpreting the hero's powers. This could sometimes be the result of a story development that other writers didn't plan for, but one that they had to find a way to work with. For example, Barbara Gordon was shot during The Killing Joke, and she was paralyzed from the waist down. So when she returned in John Ostrander and Kim Yale's Suicide Squad, Barbara leaned into her computer skills and became Oracle. As Oracle, Barbara was the most interesting that she ever been, eventually moving on to lead the Birds of Prey, and even being the dispatcher for the Justice League. Even now, there are many people, including I admit myself, who preferred Barbara as Oracle and didn't like that they put her back in the Batgirl suit. But because of Killing Joke, her later writers had to make the best of Barbara's new situation, and they found a way to make her even better.
That is a great example of how to do it right. I love me some Batgirl, and in my personal opinion, though, is that Gail Simon's run was particularly badass. But Barbara seemed to have really come into her own by literally reclaiming her life and purpose as Oracle, and I think that's why it worked so well. The character herself was going through a reclamation and reinvention. It wasn't just some hand waving of new information.
Exactly, but I think there was one example of that kind of reinvention that you wanted to talk about, Mike. Why don't you talk about how Jason Todd was redefined as the Red Hood?
Ah, I'd love to. Jason Todd's first pre-crisis incarnation was as the son of circus acrobats Joseph Todd and Trina Todd, who were killed by Killer Croc. Jason is later adopted by Bruce Wayne and becomes Robin, which almost exactly mirrors Dick Grayson's origin story from the 40s. And in many ways, Jason was originally just a bouncing board for Batman and was a bit too similar to his predecessor, Dick Grayson. This did not go over well with fans, who, according to Batman's editor in 1986, Dennis O'Neil, saw Jason Todd as usurping Dick Grayson's position. So after Crisis on Infinite Earth, DC took the opportunity to reinvent Jason Todd and many other characters. The new Jason Todd, under writer Max Allan Collins, was a rebel, even as a Robin. He smokes, he swears, he fights authority, and he's also prone to being extremely violent, and it is even implied that he broke Batman's no-killing rule by hucking a guy off a roof. He's also prone to defying Batman's orders like a bratty little kid. His origin was changed too. In the new origin, Jason Todd is a young street orphan with a junkie mother who overdosed, leaving Jason with nothing but the streets and his wits to survive. He first runs into Batman because Jason is caught stealing the hubcaps off the Batmobile. As Bruce Wayne, Batman sees to it that Jason Todd is placed in a school for troubled youths, which unfortunately turns out to be Ma Gunn's school for crime. But Jason earns his place as the second Robin by taking 6 months of training and helping Batman apprehend this gang of thieves. Batman notes that while Todd doesn't possess Dick Grayson's natural athleticism and acrobatic skills, he can become a productive crime fighter by channeling his rage. He also believes that if he doesn't help Jason, he will eventually become part of the criminal element. But it seems like DC just couldn't nail down Jason Todd into a character that fans like, since they hated this version of him too. So in 1988, only 2 years after he was first reinvented, DC Comics held a telephone poll for a Death in the Family storyline, where fans got to call in and decide whether or not Jason would die at the hands of the Joker or be saved by Batman. The poll ended in favor of killing Jason Todd. But that would not be the end of him. No, Jason Todd would go through one more reinvention in the hands of Judd Winnick in his Under the Hood story in 2005, where Jason Todd becomes the best version of himself as the Red Hood. This was made into an animated movie called Batman Under the Red Hood that is hailed by many as one of the greatest animated Batman movies. The story is a little complicated, but basically Talia al Ghul resurrects Jason Todd in a Lazarus pit, which initially drives Jason mad. Ra's al Ghul says that the power of the pit resulted in Todd's mental instability and refers to him as a curse and a pestilence unleashed upon the planet, saying that madness may affect him for hours, months, or decades. Whatever the case, Jason did not remain rabid forever and returned to Gotham as an anti-hero who was willing to kill and now use a dagger like one of Ra's al Ghul's blades and a pair of customized IDW Jericho 941s fitted with extra pick rails and mini red dot sights. There was some later refining by Scott Lobdell in the New 52, which retcons Jason's past to have been fully orchestrated by the Joker. It also stepped up Jason's training to max levels. Jason Todd was not just trained by Batman; he was trained by the League of Assassins, the All Cast, which gave him the very cool All Blades, along with a plethora of trainers of the same caliber of those that trained Bruce, ultimately making him the most trained of the Bat family. I feel like Jason finally came into his own when he became the Red Hood.
Oh, that's awesome. I know you're not alone in preferring Jason Todd as the Red Hood, and he could admittedly be annoying in some of his stories as Robin, which is probably why people voted to kill him off. The whole reason Jason came into play in the first place as Robin was that Marv Wolfman was having issues with the Batman office regarding Dick Grayson. Wolfman's solution in keeping him in the Titans was having Dick Grayson become Nightwing, while a new Robin allowed for the Batman and younger Robin stories that the Bat office wanted to do. But it took Tim Drake, another Marv Wolfman character, to really make Robin work the way they wanted. So, like Nightwing, Jason ended up taking his own identity as the Red Hood, taking his own approach, and setting himself apart from Nightwing and Batman. I admit Jason wasn't a personal favorite of mine for a while, though I thought that Chip Zdarsky's Urban Legend story managed to humanize him enough that I began to like him by that point.
I can see what you mean. Jason Todd is a character that keeps people at a distance and has a lot of attitude, but it's all really just a part of his defense mechanisms. I mean, you really have to take the time to get past those to get to know Jason. And in my opinion, then you see why Arsenal and Starfire are so attached to him and why they're willing to forgive his faults.
Yeah, that's totally fair. One other drastic approach is when writers decided to retcon a character's history to justify a new take. But I think that requires a brief explanation for our listeners. For those who don't know, the term retcon is short for retroactive continuity, and it refers to the way writers will revise established history to suit the story they're telling. One of the best known retcons is when the Swamp Thing was revealed to be a swamp creature with the memories of Alec Holland. Originally, Swampy believed he was Alec Holland, but Moore changed that idea completely.
Ah, the old planarian worm trick.
Yeah.
but seriously, I agree wholeheartedly. Moore did that retcon brilliantly. By adding a bit of science to the fantastical creation of Swamp Thing, Moore made it easier to accept with a newfound clarity. Moore suggested that the plant life and microorganisms in the swamp consumed Alec Holland's body at a rapid rate because of the biorestorative formula that covered Alec's burning body. And like the planarian worms, who were able to finish a maze after consuming another planarian worm who had been trained to do that same maze, they consumed Alec Holland's memories, and in some ways who he was along with his corpse, and grew the vegetable version of a man. I mean, great example, Steve.
So let's get into where the term retcon came from. Contrary to popular belief, retroactive continuity was first coined by E. Frank Tupper in his 1973 book, The Theory of Wolfhard Pannenberg. Roy Thomas would later appropriate that term, using it in a letter column that he wrote in All-Star Squadron, which he was writing at the time. It's not clear whether Roy Thomas read the book and decided to use that term, or someone else suggested the idea to him after he read the book. Either way, Thomas was the first one to use it in comics, and then the term became popularized in online conversation in the late 80s to the early 90s. After that, it's pretty much stuck, and that's been the standard term even outside of comics for continuity changes like this. Now, retcons can be dangerous to use, though they can reap rewards too. The retcon button can sometimes lead to some really great ideas and develop characters in new and fascinating ways, like we talked about with Swamp Thing. Retcons can also fix broken characters, which in my view is the best use of them. However, poorly written retcons can also cause a great deal of damage, sometimes fixing things that aren't broken. As much as I love Ben Reilly as a character, trying to retcon Ben into being the real Peter Parker and Peter's being the clone during the Clone Saga was a really bad idea. So bad, in fact, that they had to resurrect the Green Goblin to undo it. That resurrection itself was a retcon, and an example of how retcons can be used to repair broken characters. So the retcon is a valid tool in the writer's toolbox, but to me, it's one that's best handled with care. Are there any thoughts that you have on this, Mike?
Definitely. I guess I first want to say that, in my opinion, especially when it comes to beloved characters, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I think that retconning just so a writer can do the story they want shows almost no respect for the fans they want to read their books. I think that if this is what a writer intends to do, they should move forward as if walking through a minefield. However, if the writer has a new way of looking at the already existing canon, like with our example of Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, I think that it is much more respectful, inventive, and a better way to change a character. Basically, where things stay for the most part the same, but we're just seeing it in a different way. But actually, I believe you have a perfect example of what we're talking about, don't you, Steve?
I do indeed. Probably the one character who has been best served by retcons, at least to me, is the Hulk. His two greatest runs in the comics were built by retcons, and those runs were by Peter David and Al Ewing. We'll probably tackle the Hulk at some point, so I'll keep the descriptions relatively brief, but these two runs changed the character so completely that they've defined the character. I will be honest, though, the Hulk was not interesting to me for a very long time. I know there are people who love the 70s interpretation, but to me it wasn't very deep or compelling.
I'm a big fan of the Hulk being this uncontrollable rage monster that the army wants to use as a weapon, and so Bruce is constantly on the run. I liked how the story reflected a struggle with rage and anger, and the isolating and destructive effects it can have on those who struggle with that. But I mean, I can also see where the story would need to evolve beyond that too.
That's fair. There were some good stories here and there, and I don't want to take away from anybody who worked on them. But it took Al Milgrom and then Peter David to make the first big revelation that made the character sing, at least for me. That change was the reveal that the Hulk is not a separate being from Bruce Banner. Bruce Banner is a case of dissociative identity disorder, or what used to be called multiple personality disorder. This was caused by years of parental abuse by Bruce's father, Brian. Over time, it would be revealed that the Savage Hulk, the dumb green Hulk that we normally think of, is Bruce Banner's inner child. Milgram brought back the Gray Hulk from Stan Lee's run, but Peter David developed him into a completely different personality, one that represented the surly, moody teenager inside Bruce. This made Bruce more interesting because he was repressing these different sides of himself that would manifest as different Hulks. That opened up new doors for the character, so many that Peter David would stay on the book for a 12-year run. Hulk would lose his way again after Peter David left the first time, though David would return to the character a few times after that. There were a lot of stories that didn't make sense after he left, and often Hulk would be brought back to basics every time a new writer took over, so you didn't get much consistency when they came to the Hulk. Not to mention that important supporting characters would be killed off from time to time, and then Hulk died himself during Civil War II after Hawkeye shot him through the eye with an arrow.
You know, you made another good point there about reinventions. I mean, the good ones, as you alluded to earlier, are the ones that stick. Inconsistency and multiple short lived reinventions only does damage to the character and their canon.
Exactly, which leads into the latest Hulk reinvention that really stuck. Al Ewing took over after the Avengers No Surrender event that he was a part of, and he was the one who brought the Hulk back. That title launches a new series called Immortal Hulk, which was more horror inspired and leaned into body horror and psychological horror. That title ran for 50 issues, not counting various one shots that were recently connected as Immortal Hulk Apocrypha. Ewing brought Hulk back from the dead, and he also brought back the lost supporting characters, and it was through one very simple retcon. It turns out that all the Hulks have the ability to come back from the dead, as they can all return through a quasi-mystical green door from a mysterious hell dimension. Hulks go there when they die, and then they come back the next night completely reborn. Considering that all of Bruce's closest friends have been Hulks at one time or another, that made their deaths a pretty easy fix with the green door.
Yeah. Having not read that, I have a couple of questions. The whole green door scene thing seems to imply that there's some kind of supernatural necessity for a Hulk. I mean, is this just happenstance that all Hulks can do that?
That's a very good question, and that in fact is addressed by Ewing when we see what is behind the green door. Look for the third volume called Hulk in Hell, and then the last arc if you really want to know more about that. Although information is sprinkled through the run about this, I don't want to spoil all the answers because that's part of the fun of that series, but it does explore the connection between the various Hulks and the larger purpose of the Hulk in the scheme of things. Ewing also developed Bruce Banner's system of alters, or alternate personalities, defining their relationships with each other in a way we hadn't seen before. But Ewing's biggest contribution in that area is fleshing out the Devil Hulk persona created by Paul Jenkins. Where he was meant to represent the tempting devil figure originally, Ewing's Devil Hulk became the father figure personality who was driven by instinct and magical thinking. Devil could smell lies, and his main interest in protecting Bruce like a dad would. He's a really fascinating character now in a way that he wasn't before. But none of that would have been possible without the retcon of the Green Door and completely reworking the Hulk's mindscape. The Hulk is one of my favorite characters now, and I didn't used to care about him at all. And all of that is because I find the psychology of Bruce Banner interesting because of all these changes and the different personalities that are locked within him. Mike, is there any character that you really think has been made better because of a good retcon?
Well, I mean, I've talked about how Wonder Woman was done wrong, but In my opinion, she was definitely done right by Brian Azzarello in the New 52 relaunch. The new series was darker than it had been before. Azzarello even described it as a horror comic, which you know I love, and totally enveloped her in her Greek mythological roots. Wonder Woman receives the power of flight by one of Hermes' feathers piercing her thigh, which I thought was a much better explanation. The Zero issue showed that Diana had been trained to fight by Ares, the god of war himself. But despite Ares' intentions, she also learns mercy by not killing the Minotaur Ares told her to kill. While Ares saw this as a weakness and a failure on Diana's part, she eventually replaced him as the god of war. I thought this was just brilliant. Also, the male Amazons are introduced in the series, which answers the question of how new Amazons are even born. It turns out that Amazons used to infrequently invade the ships coming near the island and force themselves on the sailors and then kill them. But I mean, we're talking about Amazons here. I'm sure some of the sailors were willing. But seriously, after 9 months, the birth of the female children are highly celebrated and inducted into the proper ranks of the Amazons, while the male children are rejected. In order to save the children from being killed by the Amazons, Hephaestus trades them with the Amazons in exchange for weapons. To me, Azarella's Wonder Woman will always be the best Wonder Woman, my badass horror Wonder Woman. And I'm not the only one who was impressed with this interpretation. Timothy Callahan of Comic Book Resources called the title the best of the New 52. I mean, I'd say that was a change for the good, wouldn't you?
Yeah, that's a good choice. I thought that the art by Cliff Chiang was consistently excellent, and I know that this run has its fans. It just wasn't for me, speaking as a fan of the pre-Flash Wonder Woman, but I don't want to get too much into this, as we've already talked about this run in depth during our Wonder Woman episode, and I don't want to rehash what we've already covered there.
Yeah, I clearly need to do a lot more reading if I'm going to come up with more examples. But in my defense, I am trying.
You're doing fine. But why don't we move in a different direction instead? Besides, I don't want to really neglect the villains here. Sometimes villains have needed to be reinvented as well. Villains occasionally lose their menace because the stories take away their edge or because they just get away from what made them work originally. Sometimes you get that villain who finds the right take and becomes a truly dangerous or fascinating opponent for the first time. So let's talk about those for a bit. Sometimes you get a case where a character comes out of nowhere and becomes an instant fan favorite. One of the villains that took me by surprise in Batman the Animated Series was Mr. Freeze. This is a character who had been written off as a joke, and most people remembered him from Batman 66. But Paul Dini came in and completely changed the character in the episode Heart of Ice. This Mr. Freeze was a tragic figure, driven by the desire to save his wife from an incurable illness. This move worked brilliantly because Freeze echoes Batman's own motivations. Freeze is driven to crime by the love of his wife, like Bruce is driven to fight crime because of the loss of his parents. You completely understand why Victor Freeze is doing what he's doing, even if he's breaking the law. I'll also add that the visual redesign is brilliant, and I recently find out why it's so good. The designer of that costume is none other than Mike Mignola, the creator of Hellboy.
Wow. Wow. You know, I did like that version quite a bit. I mean, who can't relate to desperately wanting to save the person you love? Anybody who is in love or has been in love can imagine that feeling, or in some cases, they've actually lived through it. I feel like the character lost something in the New 52 when he was rewritten as just a wacko obsessed with cold.
Oh, agreed. Fortunately, that didn't last, and he's since gone back to something closer to the Dini version. Peter Tomasi's run on Detective Comics was very much inspired by Batman the Animated Series, and Mr. Freeze was a part of that. That was post-reverse, so I'm guessing they swept the New 52 version under the rug, in my view, rightly so. But speaking of Taz, I've noticed that Paul Dini is really good at this kind of thing. I also want to point out that Dini also reinvented Mr. Mxyzptlk over in Superman the Animated Series as well. That episode is easily my favorite version of Mixie. But looking back to Batman villains, he also did a great job in making Hush work in a comic story he did. Is there a favorite Batman villain of yours that got a good reinvention, Mike?
Yes, there is, and well, I know that you're probably going to disagree with this as you hate the Joker, but my favorite Batman villain will always be the Joker. I've been a huge fan since 1989 when I saw Jack Nicholson's portrayal of the character. But the Joker, unlike the others we've talked about, is a character that is actually defined by reinvention, as he's constantly adapting. So much so that this constant revolution and refinement process is written in as a character trait. We find out in Grant Morrison's Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth, that the Joker is constantly adapting to his environment because it's the only way he can process the external sensory information. The result of which is he's able to create a new personality for himself every day, depending on what would benefit him. This is expounded on in The Clown at Midnight and Batman number 663 from '07, where the Joker enters an introspective meditative state where he evaluates and modifies his previous selves and amalgamates new personalities based on his needs.
I don't think we disagree as much as you might expect. I do make no secret of the fact that I can't stand most versions of the Joker, Mark Hamill and Heath Ledger aside. He's a character who tends to move around in circles and rehashing the same dance steps with Batman most of the time. You know, break out of Arkham, do something horrible, tempt Batman into killing him and fail, go back to Arkham, rinse, repeat. But I agree that Grant Morrison's Joker is one of the exceptions because Morrison broke away from that formula. Clown at Midnight went a long way towards explaining him, opening doors that were not there before. I also like the version that showed up in Batman and Robin, also under Morrison, where he took the Oberon Sexton Gravedigger identity. He achieves his goals there by being a manipulator, not by leaving bodies by the truckload. I felt like that version offered more than just being a one-note serial killer who goes through the same motions.
I can see why you would think that, but I think I look at the same information just a little differently, or perhaps just from a different angle. In some of his incarnations, he is a bit one-noted, though, and that's actually one of the reasons I prefer the more modern Joker. He has no modus operandi, so while the song may be similar, it's a different lead track playing over the top of it, if that makes sense. But I am getting a little ahead of myself here.
Sure, and I admit I'm a bit curious myself. Why don't you get into what you like about the modern Joker?
In the comics, the Joker is a devious criminal mastermind and a psychopath with a twisted and often sadistic sense of humor that is only humorous to his dark mind. The Joker has no powers, but he has a genius level intellect, and he is an expert in chemical engineering, which has allowed him to develop various poisonous or otherwise lethal concoctions over the decades. But his bread and butter has always been his Joker venom. The Joker also likes to use thematic weapons like razor-tipped playing cards, joy buzzers with a lethal electrical charge, and acid-spraying flowers. As Batman's arch-nemesis, the Joker has played a major role in a couple of the Bat family's most defining stories. Stories like murdering the second Robin, Jason Todd, by beating him almost to death with a crowbar and then blowing him up, and paralyzing and, at least by implication, raping Commissioner Gordon's daughter, Barbara Gordon, a.k.a. Batgirl, by shooting her in the spine with a gun.
Yeah, it is true that Joker is responsible for causing more pain to the Bat family than most villains I could name. It's one reason why I suspect they keep bringing him back over and over again.
That is for certain. I think another would be that the Joker is the antithesis of Batman in every way, and that makes for good storytelling.
Right. We talked about the villain as the hero's dark mirror in The Purpose of a Great Villain. I think that episode is worth revisiting if you want more context about what we mean by this. But the Joker is definitely a great opposing force when done right.
So true, but there have been variations on the personality and character traits of the Joker in both comics, film, and television, and I'm going to go over them briefly here. One of these personalities is the clown persona, which could be practically harmless, campy, and silly, or he could be a homicidal maniac, but both have a fondness for theatrics and thievery. But in this version, the Joker is only criminal because it gets him the attention he wants so desperately. You can find this version of the Joker in Batman comics from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and later in live action by Cesar Romero in Batman 66.
Yeah, it's not hard to imagine why Batman writers felt that the Joker needed to evolve from that. The clown version worked for Golden and Silver Age type of stories and for Batman 66, but that's not exactly arch villain material in this day and age, is it?
No, not at all. And if he had stayed like that, I definitely would not be a fan today, and I don't think many others would be either. But let's get into the second persona of the Joker, and that is the criminal or gangster persona of the Joker. He's pragmatic, even philosophical, surprisingly serious, not prone to fits of laughter like the clown, but rather he is vicious and cruel. He will stand over your body with blood on his hands and laugh, not because your life means nothing to him, but because death for him is the punchline. You can find a version of this Joker in Brian Azzarello's Joker from 2008, where we see him take a former employee named Monty, who had become a high ranking member of the criminal underworld in Joker's absence, into the back room of his own club and skin him alive. Then, as the Joker is a gangster and he has to send a message to ensure that everyone else gets the point too, the Joker leads the now skinless Monty into the audience and leaves him to die on the stage. I mean, damn. Thus, he took back his dominion. But I mean, there's a toned down version of this gangster Joker portrayed by Jack Nicholson in 1989's Batman. But I think the best portrayal of this version is played by Jared Leto in the DCEU. I also think that the anarchist persona played by Heath Ledger in The Dark Knight is an amalgamation of this version and the comedian persona, which I'll talk about next.
The criminal was the version of the Joker I liked the most in Three Jokers, if I'm absolutely honest. I felt like the criminal killed people for a purpose, that he had planned out the joke in advance, even if others around him didn't get it. He's trying to make a point with his crimes, and there's a method to his madness, something that I think is essential when it comes to his insane villains. If this was the Joker that we'd seen in the past few decades, I might actually like him a lot more, but we only see him sporadically, and when we do, he's usually cast aside in some way. I feel like one of Three Joker's biggest mistakes is that they killed that version off.
He is a great version of the Joker. There is no doubt about that. And they definitely should have kept him around. I'm going to talk about this last version of the Joker. And after that, I'd actually like to hear your thoughts on the idea that the anarchist persona is an amalgamation of the criminal gangster and the comedian personas.
That's an interesting idea, and one that I think sounds plausible to me. Christopher Nolan had certainly done his homework when it came to the Joker, so he might well have researched the different versions when creating his own. It is true that the anarchist has a method to his madness which echoes the criminal. At the same time, I do get a hint of healing joke when talking about the Joker's multiple choice past. And this version is definitely an agent of chaos who is trying to disrupt the order that Batman is trying to preserve. So it sounds like a reasonable theory, at least.
Thanks. I actually really put some thought into that. Last but definitely not least is the dark comedian, whose jokes are only funny to him because he's a sadist, and that is, in Dave Mustaine's words, addicted to chaos. This version has no specific modus operandi and changes who he kills, why he kills, and how he kills all the time. Some people he just kills, others he tortures, and others are just tools of spreading chaos, anarchy, and division. In my opinion, this is the most dangerous, terrifying, and evil of all the Joker's various personalities. He is depraved, sadistic psychopath, and a malicious monster whose cruelty and violence know no bounds, even to himself. We see this Joker have his own face cut off and hang it on the wall just to mess with Batman. And then he strapped the hunk of skin back on his face with staples, giving him a truly grim and creepy smile. This is my favorite version of the Joker, and in great part it's because of Snyder's death of the family storyline. Despite being insane and a liar, Joker uses a blend of manipulation and violence to essentially destroy the bonds of the Bat family under the storm of doubt and mistrust, turning even Batman's own son and adopted sons against him. In my opinion, this is the reinvention the Joker has always needed.
That sounds cool. I haven't read a whole lot of the Scott Snyder run, so I'll take your word on that. But then I know how much you love slashers, and Joker is the slasher villain of the DCU.
Guilty as charged. That's a big reason I'm a fan.
Now, it's one thing to reinvent a main character or even a singular villain or two. It's another thing to have a book where virtually everything had to be reinvented on some level or another. Sometimes that reinvention is gradual rather than immediate too, which brings us to The Flash. When Barry Allen sacrificed himself in Crisis on Infinite Earths, DC needed a new Flash to carry the torch. That task fell on Wally West, who up to that point had been Kid Flash. Wally was not initially that great of a character, even during his appearances in New Teen Titans. That started to change, though, when Wally got his own title as The Flash. which started with Mike Barron and then by William Messner Loebs. But what really made Wally an A-list hero was a run by a then unknown writer by the name of Mark Waid. Waid began a story with a story called Born to Run, which is a retelling of Wally's origin and how he became Barry's sidekick. But it was really a story about Wally's relationship with his two fathers, his real dad Rudolph and Barry Allen, who became Wally's father in spirit. It went a long way towards showing us who Wally West was. He just loved being the Flash, and he just wanted to help people like his Uncle Barry did. Later on, Waid would spend years of work in getting Wally out of the shadow of Barry Allen, and I think most people would agree that he succeeded so well that Wally is considered the one former sidekick who is held in as high of regard or even higher than his mentor. Wally defeated Professor Zoom, or the Reverse Flash, in what is probably his definitive story, titled The Return of Barry Allen. Spoiler, Barry does not actually return, but you get an epic fight between Wally and Eobard Thawne. And Wally overcomes one of his biggest mental blocks in the process. It's a great emotional arc for Wally West, and it proves why he deserves the mantle of the Flash. I also want to mention Terminal Velocity, which redefined how super speed works with the Speed Force. But it's also a really good Wally story. It shows where Wally first starts to outrun Barry. Most of all, it's a love story about Wally and his then girlfriend Linda Park, now his wife. And Wally comes back from the Speed Force because of his love for Linda. He literally comes back from death because Linda is that important to him. He grew a lot as a person and as a hero during Waid's run on the book, along with Brian Augustyn, R.I.P. And I think that defining moment illustrates why Wally West is such an awesome character. Certainly, Waid's first run is why Wally will always be my Flash.
I have not read those, I'll be honest. But I think that if I had, I would feel the same way. My main experience with Wally comes from the Justice League and the Justice League Unlimited series, where he is made into a bit of a wisecracking joke of a character. But I have to admit, I like the much more serious Wally West you're describing there.
Yeah, that version of Wally is a bit different from the Mark Waid version. I think they took the Justice League Wally from the earlier Wally stories, where Wally was more of a fun-loving hothead and who liked to hit on anything that moved. Totally valid take, if a bit different. But that's not all that was reinvented with the Flash. Another run came along and reinvented all the villains. That run came from Jeff Johns, who came along in the book and reinvented all the Flash's villains, but especially Captain Cold and the Rogues. Mike, do you want to talk about them?
Sure. The Rogues have always been a little different than the average villains and villain teams. I find it interesting that when the Secret Society of Supervillains formed during the Final Crisis event, that the Rogues wouldn't join up with them. And during the Forever Evil event, the Rogues fought against the crime syndicate. Granted, in both cases, their reasons were selfish, but still. They even team up with Flash occasionally when it's necessary, but that's not all that sets them apart. They have a pretty strict code of conduct. They don't use drugs and they don't kill unless it's absolutely necessary. Their goal is always the job, and they're very professional about it, so they have high standards for membership. Also, their bond strengthened to what became almost like a family unit rather than just a team in Jeff Johns' run. What I mean is there is more to who is who and why than just the score now. For instance, Lisa Snark, Captain Cold's sister, is now in love with Mirror Master instead of the Top. She is no longer dead, and in fact, she is the one who reforms the Rogues to get revenge on the Flash. But she's also initially dying of a brain tumor caused by a procedure her brother Leonard Snark convinced her and the other Rogues to take part in that went awry and exploded. Captain Cold is given the motivation of guilt over what happened to her and the Rogues, and a desire to get his sister what she needs to survive as motivation for what he's doing rather than just the score initially.
That sounds about right to me. Even Wayne never quite moved the Rogues past the Silver Age, though he did a great job with the Pied Piper's redemption arc. Johns came in with the idea of making Captain Cold a villain in the vein of Parker from the Richard Stark novels, a bad guy who operates by a code in his own set of rules. Cold, I think, truly became A-list under Johns, with a more understandable backstory and complex relationships with the Flash and the other Rogues. The Wally West run that Johns did gradually set all the Rogues up, with each issue making each of the Rogues a more rounded character. I found myself caring about Heatwave, Weather Wizard, and Mirror Master in ways I didn't before. You also get the occasional replacement, like the Axel Walker version of Trickster, and even new villains who moved in and out of the rogues occasionally. They're basically their own fraternity with their own set of rules and very different than most villains in comics.
I think you're 100% right on that. I personally like the idea of looking at thievery as a profession with rules and protocol to follow. I also like that there are different rosters to work with, like how they did on the Ocean's 11 movies. And the Rogues are definitely DC's Ocean's 11, with Captain Cold as Daniel Ocean. I find this type of thief to be much more believable villain. While I may not agree with what these villains do, I can see how, from their perspective, what they're doing isn't wrong or evil. It's just a job, and this is their skill set.
Ocean's 11 is a great comparison, and that's exactly what they are. Cold is the mastermind for the rogues in the way that Danny Ocean is, and they all operate by a set of rules for the most part. Cold is ruthless about enforcing that code, which is what I think sets them apart a bit from Ocean, but the principle is there. They're all about honor among thieves, and I like how they have a conflicted relationship with the various Flashes. There's a respect with the Flash, whether it's Barry or Wally, and they're more interested in getting Flash out of the way than actually in killing him. It's not a brutal or sadistic grudge like you see with Thawne or Grodd, but I think there's more to it, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. When you talk about reinventions under Johns, though, I think the major change came with giving the rogues superpowers. Before, the rogues all used specialized handheld weapons to fight, another thing that actually set them apart from other villains. But in the New 52, Leonard Snart, aka Captain Cold, Mick Rory, aka Heatwave, Sam Scudder, aka Mirror Master, and Marco Martin, aka Weather Wizard, underwent a procedure at an unknown facility that would merge them with their weapons, giving them superpowers. But things went bad in a real serious way. Lisa Snart, who was also at the facility, was caught in the explosion, and it turned her into an astral projection of herself with superpowers called the Golden Glider, after a brief bout with a brain tumor that was also caused by that event. The rest of the rogues were given superpowers, but at great cost to each of them. Captain Cold, having bonded with his cold gun, became unable to turn off his ice powers, and is seen being unable to even drink a beer because everything around him freezes solid. Heatwave is bonded with his flamethrowers and gains pyrokinesis, but he was also severely burned, and I'm talking like Freddy Krueger burned. The weather wizard's wand tied itself to his emotions so that the weather changed with his moods, and he was often severely depressed. Sam Scudder, aka Mirror Master, would be seemingly forever trapped in the mirror world after that. The rogues blamed Cold for this and turned against him and followed his sister Lisa, who had reformed the group. However, they are forced to team up with Flash, Cold, and the Pied Piper when Gorilla Grodd invades Central City, and they are back together again by the Forever Evil event.
Now, I haven't read a lot of that, but I do want to clarify a point on Mirror Master. Sam Scudder, the original Mirror Master, was brought in with the reboot. I think he was dead previously. Pre-Flashpoint, there was a second Mirror Master, a Scotsman named Evan McCullough. He was created by Grant Morrison during his Animal Man run. McCullough's whole thing is that he was using the mirrors to escape reality, and his issues with drugs got him in trouble with Cold more than once. He was Mirror Master through the Wade run, and he gave Wally a lot of trouble over the years. Johns also used McCullough during his run on Wally West, and he's still probably my favorite version of Mirror Master to this day. I keep hoping they'll bring McCullough back in some form, even with Scudder back as Mirror Master.
No, we're in a similar boat, actually, in that I only picked up the story at Flash Rebirth, so I didn't get that background on the character, and I think I'm with you about McCullough being a better version. I like the idea of using mirrors to escape reality. I feel like, granted, I kind of like a little bit of mental illness in my characters, but it really seems like it adds a nice layer of depth to the character as you consider why someone would want to hide from what is real.
Absolutely. So I think we've covered a good range of characters, both heroes and villains, that have benefited from a good reinvention. What I think it shows is that a good writer can make most characters work if they have the right amount of passion for the character and the right take that fits the character. As writers, I'm sure we both have characters like that. While I wouldn't want to talk too much about specific ideas, or on the off chance we actually get to do them, it might actually be fun to mention them. Mike, are there any characters you love to give your hands on and reinvent if given a chance?
Oh, yes. I believe the MCU has lost what makes the Hulk great, and I would like to return him to his tragic roots, like he was in the Incredible Hulk movie with Edward Norton. I want to write the suicidal Bruce Banner that struggles with life and relationships as he's constantly on the run from the military and in fear of turning into the rage monster Hulk again. The story I have in mind involves the Hulk destroying a small town in a fit of rage for seemingly no reason, and hundreds die. But the whole attack on the city was instigated and orchestrated behind the scenes by the leader, who has reconnected with the Abomination and sent him in to set up the Hulk by revealing to Bruce that Betty was just murdered, which isn't true. But the loss and pain quickly turns explosive, and the Hulk is unleashed as Abomination slips away back to the leader. Abomination is more willing to take part in this because the leader has promised him more power and enough strength for a victorious rematch with the Hulk. Hulk's fit of rage for reasons unknown to the town is captured on a helicopter camera, and the FF are horrified by what they see, as is the rest of the country and the world. The U.S. Army happily enlists the volunteering FF to capture and contain the Hulk. With all four of them working as a team, they are able to capture the Hulk in a special containment field designed by Richards based on the same type of shield Sue is able to produce. Reed desperately wants to study and understand the Hulk for the science and to see if he can help the suicidal Bruce Banner. This suits General Ross just fine, as he wants to find out how he can get those powers for himself, which he does when Reed Richards shares the science with Ross out of a sense of duty, having no idea that Ross would use it to become the Red Hulk. Red Hulk goes to the leader, as he is the only one with the tech and power source needed to use the tech and power source needed to use what Reed Richards gave him. The climax of which would be a big fight between Red Hulk, now working with the leader, and Abomination against the Fantastic Four and Hulk, ending in the Hulk and FS victory. Reed Richards reveals that Betty Ross is not in fact dead, and that he has a serum that he believes will work to subdue the Hulk and Banner's psyche, but it only leads to further division of Bruce's personality, and Bruce goes on the run again.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. The MCU really has not done Hulk justice at all. I do agree that a proper Hulk versus Fantastic Four movie would be really awesome. It's big, it's action packed, it gives you plenty of smashing, and I like the Red Hulk, so that's cool with me. While I tend to be particular on Hulk, I actually don't think it's possible for the Hulk that I would want to see to work on the big screen. It would need another TV series, and preferably one much longer than the six episode affairs we see on Disney Plus now. You need room to get in the depth of the Hulk psychology, and we just haven't gotten that in the MCU films. So I definitely agree he needs a reworking there. And I think your approach could set up something like what I have in mind, so I'm down with that.
Thank you. I think actually that a show that ran for a good like 5 seasons or more would be amazing. There's so much to the Hulk universe that can be explored. But I believe you had something in mind for some DC and Marvel characters of your own.
Well, yes, I have ideas in mind for the Marvel family, Shazam. With the exception of Black Adam, who's actually getting a really interesting book coming out from Christopher Priest. I felt for a long time that DC hasn't really gotten Captain Marvel or any of the Marvels in general. This goes back even before the New 52, but the Shazam books they've done up to this point missed the mark even more. The amazing thing about it is, I feel like Captain Marvel has such an awesome wish fulfillment concept and an underlying metaphor that I think anybody could relate to. But DC keeps moving away from the charm and the sense of wonder that Captain Marvel used to have, and making Billy Batson less and less of a hero. I want Billy Batson to be a pure and noble champion and show why he's worthy of the power of Shazam.
I know how you feel about changing a good, wholesome character that are defined by good morals, ethics, and wisdom, like Captain America, Superman, and Doctor Who. It's just not right. Changing defining character traits definitely seems like the wrong way to go in reinventing a character. I suppose the exception would be a story about how they became moral, ethical, and wise. I mean, if
Mhm.
we're showing the journey, I think a little of that can go well if it's not taken too far like they did with the New 52 Superman.
Very true. As for Marvel, I'd love to get a shot at the New Warriors over at Marvel. This book used to be awesome in the early 90s. The characters were great, and the stories challenged the characters and were thought provoking to the readers. But it seems like most runs since then, when they have been even published, have drifted away from that. Even the original concept got appropriated by the Champions, leaving the Warriors without an identity. And the last time Marvel tried to bring them back, it was such a laughingstock that the book never even came out. I think the New Warriors can still work, but they need to get back to what worked before, and they need a new identity that still reflects what the Warriors should be about.
I don't know much about the New Warriors other than I remember them being really popular in the 90s. I back then I really liked the Night Thrasher character, but I mean what you're talking about there sounds good.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Night Thrasher. He was one of those characters who could only have taken off in the 90s. I think if you try to suggest a skateboard riding hero today, you'd be laughed at. But he really was cool back in the day, and I think you had to be there back then to really get a feel for that. There was a clear Batman influence that was in his origin, but it came with a very strong twist later on. And I think the control freak personality of Thrash, where he tries to control everything around him out of fear of losing everything he cares about, has a lot of possibilities. He just needs to get his edge back. But to be honest, my real favorite among the Warriors is Nova. He's an underdog hero, even among underdog heroes. Certainly, he's the underdog among the cosmic heroes, which is pretty impressive. He's not the brightest or the strongest, but he has a refusal to say die on a par with Ben Grimm. That gets him through a lot of tough scrapes, and it's hard not to love a character like that.
Yeah, heart can carry you a long way. And for me, a big heart really makes a character immediately endeared to me. I mean, we Irish think it is just as honorable to take a big beating, leave it all in the ring, and lose the fight as it is to win one. And we particularly love a good, heart-filled comeback. You know, when they just get their ass beat and they climb up back from the trenches like a phoenix. You know what I mean? I think you just made me a Nova fan. But that about wraps up our discussion on reinvented or reclaimed characters. But there are a lot more out there that we didn't get to, and we want to hear from you about your favorite heroes and villains that have been reclaimed or reinvented. You can always get a hold of us on Twitter at Omen Revelations with your favorite characters and any questions or comments. And last but far from least, we want to give a big thank you to our patrons who make this podcast possible. I hope you've had fun hanging out with us today on ORP. I know that Steve and I have had fun making this episode. If you've had fun too, we invite you to share this episode and help us get the word out.
For our Spotify listeners, we ask you to please rate our show as well. That can really help to grow our audience. But to all our listeners everywhere, we want to say thank you for listening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.